Hey folks, how you guys doing today? Jimmy Roberts here, your local real estate professional. And today we are going to talk about the sales comparison approach. Probably like, what the heck is a sales comparison approach, Jimmy?
Obviously, we'd like to know about it.
Well, I'm going to tell you. Well, first and foremost, let's start with this. When real estate is valued, there are typically three methods that we value real estate with: the income approach, the cost approach, and the sales comparison approach. That said, I just said, we're going to talk about the sales comparison approach today. We'll talk about the other ones in other videos. Why are we talking about the sales comparison approach today? Quite frankly, because it is the most often used when valuing your properties, especially if you have a single family property. And the reason for that are many, and we're going to walk through those. First and foremost, we use a sales comparison approach because it's based off of the assumption that your house can be substituted for another recently sold property. And that's a good way to help us understand what your property should be valued at. So it's based on the principle of substitution, meaning that if we had to substitute out your house for another house, and we know how much that other house was sold for, that gives us a really good idea of what your house could be sold for. That's one. Two, and this one is the one I really like. By using the sales comparison approach, it gives us an opportunity to actually tailor our data and our analysis to what's going on in today's market. So for instance, if it were a year or so ago, during the very steep rise of the housing market, it would be a good way for us to value properties at that point in time. Whereas if we value properties, use that same method today, and we're valuing properties, we know that the housing market has slowed down and cooled. So we wouldn't necessarily rely on that old data. We'd be able to rely on stuff that's happening and representative of today's market conditions. So it's a good representative of what buyers' expectations are today, regardless of when today is. Now, that said, there are some inherent problems with the sales comparison method.
And here we go.
All right, so let's jump into those. Some of those, and the biggest are based in the fact that when the sales comparison approach was first used in various communities, there was an inherent bias in those appraisers that used it and the people that valued properties at that time. For instance, I'll use the city of Detroit as an example. The city of Detroit, as you all know, is a 100-year-old city. Been around forever. Over the last, 40, 50 years or so, it's been heavily populated by African Americans, which is a wonderful thing. At one point in time, I believe it was probably the largest African American populated city, occupied and controlled by African American city in the United States. I believe that to be the case. Don't check me or anything. But if you do have better information, please put it in the comments below. Okay, that is, like I said, that was a wonderful thing. I grew up in a great city. I grew up in the city of Detroit. Amazing city. I had a wonderful time. But one thing that I did notice was that the housing stock was very similar to the suburban neighborhoods, specifically directly across 8 Mile, Ferndale, Oak Park, those areas. Housing stock very similar, and come to find out later on in life that it was actually created during the same time period. But over the years, due to a lot of different factors, consistently, homes north of 8 Mile, even though they were the same housing stock and basically were populated by the same population, were valued significantly lower than those inside Detroit. So when using the sales comparison approach, again, that was, and let's call it what it is, that really was based on some type of biases that were going on. But when that happened, that meant that a home that would sell for, say, $100,000 in, say, Ferndale would sell for, say, $80,000 in Detroit. And that happened hundreds of thousands of millions of times.
Too many things happening.
Over time, there became a huge gap between properties located in Detroit that were, again, the exact same housing stock and those located in their suburban adjacent cousin neighborhoods, right? So what happens is, again, that inherent bias of, hey, you got a property in Detroit, so that means that it's immediately worth less. Matter of fact, I'll give you an example. And this really pissed off one of my neighbors. I have a neighbor that bought a property. He thought he was buying this property in Redford. Turns out his side of the street was actually city of Detroit. So it was a street that was adjacent to Redford, that on one side of the street was Redford, on the other side of the street, it was Detroit. He put a lot of money into this rehab. He actually did a pretty good job with it. Come to find out, when it came time to appraise a property, the appraiser used all Detroit comparables. Why? Because the property was located in Detroit.
You gotta be kidding me, bro.
Again, it was the same house as those across the street, but those across the street sold for $30,000 to $40,000 more. Why? Because they were in Redford.
What?
So I'm not saying that. So why do I bring that up again? And I just want to clarify. The method itself of sales comparison is not bad. However, by using sales comparison method over and over again with an inherent bias initially, it threw off the data. It skewed the results. So now what happens is, when you're appraising a property, say in the city of Detroit, what you find is that property, if it were, again, in a lot of cases, just across the street, would be worth significantly more. But it's been codified so much that you can't use those comps across the street, because, again, you got so much data and sales data here in the city of Detroit. So you can't. It's a little goofy. It's actually very goofy when you think about it. But it is what it is, right? It is goofy, and I don't really know how to get past that. So that is one of the hugest major drawbacks from using the sales comparison method. The sales comparison method is historical, and it does rely on historical data. So again, if that historical data was flawed or it had some inherent biases, those are going to continue to be carried through. Or that is the primary flaw with using the sales comparison method. That said, out of all the evaluation methods, the three that I just showed you, the sales comparison method, in my opinion, is by far the one that we use the most, and it intuitively makes the most sense. So there you have it, the sales comparison method, an overview, as it were, some of its benefits and drawbacks. And later videos, we're going to figure out how we're going to make sure we're using the proper methods when we're actually valuing properties, because I want to make sure you're getting the highest values possible, or the most appropriate values possible for your properties. Alrighty, this is Jimmy Roberts, your local real estate professional. And with that, I will see you in the next video.